Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good, having fun? That's awesome. So when I was invited to speak to this event, given that it is a TEDxYouth event, I asked around to other young people as to what they would like to hear at such a talk. And I got variations of pretty much the same answer as to what our generation, speak about our generation, the changes that we're undergoing, because we live in pretty exciting times as well as confusing times. And basically, what being a young Indian in the 21st century is all about. So this is the title of my presentation today, A Generation in Transition. So in 2020, the average Indian is going to be 30 years of age. When I found this out, I realized that I'm going to be 30 years of age at that time. I'm going to be the average Indian, as are many of you in the audience here today. And also 10 years after that, the average person in the world is going to be an Indian. So basically, right now, it's a Chinese people are the world's most typical people. But 20 years' time, it's going to be an Indian. And we need to stop wondering when we have this whole national discourse going on right now about, what it'll be like when we're a superpower and everything, as to what the future is going to hold, because we are the future and we are shaping it today. So basically, the goals and aspirations of our generation, previous slide, please. Yeah. So the goals and aspirations of our generation and the choices we make are important, not only from the point of view of just for us personally, but also collectively. We are going to have a pretty large global footprint. And we're faced with some pretty important questions. How are we different? What difference is that going to make? And how is this ultimately going to impact our legacy? So the first thing, I think, that really defines our generation in a sense, that really makes us, is this. So as you can see, it's a ceiling fan. It's something that you'll find in pretty much any house in India. And the only difference is that for those of us born, in the 80s, who grew up, born in the 80s, the 90s, and after, we had a choice of choosing more than one kind of fan, driving more than one kind of vehicle. We have a lot more consumption choices simply because of the economic liberalization of 91. And this makes a fundamental difference in the way we perceive the options available to us. And also, it's not just about the consumption choices, but it's also about our life choices. And starting a business was so much easier after this era. And above all, we have an increased kind of an exposure and awareness of the world. The country's kind of opened up to the world in a sense. The second change that faces us is technology. So we are the first generation to actually witness the technological revolution. And we witness this not in the sense of just new technologies alone, but also in the sense of the way diffusion happens. Because if you remember the floppy disk, do you remember how long it took to transition from that to the CD? But how much shorter it was to transition from the CD to the pen drive? This diffusion is happening at unprecedented rates. And also, our generation is proving to be the most adaptable. And essentially, we can get earlier it took around 5 years just to get a telephone connection, but today we can just do it in under a day. We're not only so much more connected, but also we're really we're basically more connected by phone, but also we're connected in a different way because we're all consuming the same information, even in remote parts of the country. And that really makes a difference in the sense of giving us a sense of being part of the same community or brotherhood in a sense. So since the one thing that's actually where we've fallen behind is the fact that the literacy rates have not kept pace. So the spread of the internet has actually been a lot less fast than it could have been if this were not the case. And there are all kinds of digital divides happening these days, not just between people who have access to this technology and don't because of their community or because of their socioeconomic status, but also across generations. Because the older generation is finding it much harder to hear. If you're born into a place where the technology keeps changing, you just instantly become more adaptable. But otherwise, it's a little bit harder for the older generation to keep pace. And to people who are not on the particular social networking site, for instance, it seems sometimes that you're not even living in the same planet, and you're not essentially functioning in the same frame. So this brings me to this, even groundness. Here's who exists on the same plane today: public figures, industry leaders, celebrities, politicians, and us. They're a lot more accessible to the layman, and we're seeing a breakdown in the master-slave relationship, because through their sheer accessibility, they're kind of dependent on the masses to validate their existence, and they have to keep us happy. Even organizations have to work much harder to keep the consumer happy, because we have so much more power. Just a few tweets, a few nasty blog posts can really destroy an organization's reputation. And there's a breakdown of hierarchies, and in a very fundamental sense. And previous slide, please. Yeah. So this leads us to the question of privacy and openness. There's basically this interplay of being private and being open. So it's not just public figures, but also laymen who are kind of constantly under scrutiny, because if you walk outside your house, obviously there are people walking around with camera phones. There are security cameras everywhere. The sting operation could happen anytime. And you're also so much more connected right now, because you just are connected to everyone through your phone or through the internet. And it's you kind of have to put your linen out there. And because you have to put you are out there regardless of whether you want to be or not, you may as well keep your linen clean. And a simple example of this is, like, a lot of children of the younger generation are on Facebook, and then they're in a relationship with their boyfriend, and their grandmother is on their friends list as well. So, the whole family is in the loop about the goings-on of the younger generation. So this brings me to the question of, next slide, please. Authenticity and reality. So it's there is a lot of pressure to be more authentic, because we are constantly under scrutiny. And it's harder to keep things under wraps. So another thing that's really different about our generation is reality TV has kind of revolutionized the way we see, has revolutionized what we see in our everyday. It portrays old and new relationships and lifestyles, and old and new lifestyles and values with equanimity. So basically you see, polygamy alongside live-in relationships. And certainly our relationship with the media has changed, and our generation is certainly more accepting of different values and lifestyles, much more than the previous generation is, probably because we're just exposed to it a lot more. We see the whole range. It's harder for our parents' generation to accept that we're accepting these different lifestyles and values, even if we may not subscribe to them personally. And a lot of the moral policing comes from the older generation, not from the younger generation. We're a lot more live and let live. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the question of unity and diversity. Earlier when we spoke of diversity, your diversity stemmed from something that was kind of imposed on you in a sense, something you couldn't help because of where you were born or the language that you spoke. But today, diversity is something that you acquire through the choices you make. So what we're seeing is a composite of different Indian cultures. So the era post 91 has kind of really brought this about, and that's why our generation is being impacted so much. And this brings us to the question of choices. So clearly our generation has a lot of different options, but are we really exercising these options? Because a generation is not defined by the options they have, but the choices they make. And I'd like to tell you this interesting anecdote that happened like last year. I go to an arts college, and the thing about being a liberal arts student is that it's supposed to open up your mind to new values and experiences. And one of our professors asked us as to how many of us would not allow our parents to make that final decision as to who we were going to marry. And only 2 people raised their hands in a class of 30 students. So this really shows us that even though we're exposed to different options, it's just a small example. You can't really, I'm not one to comment on how one should choose one's life partner, but it's interesting to note that even though we are exposed to different ideas and options, we're still going for the default option. It's a little surprising that there's a clear demarcation even in our personal life. The first thing that struck me was that, do your boyfriends and girlfriends know about this? You're going out with someone, but at the end of the day, you're going to have an arranged marriage to some totally different person. And it's surprising that, so we really have to ask ourselves why this demarcation happens. And I think what I found in my research on this is that basically, I think it has to do with the way we've been taught. Several parts of the West learn through the Socratic tradition. Their education system is kind of took off from there. Was influenced by that part of Western philosophy, whereby the whole thing depends on constantly questioning. You're constantly questioning the knowledge that's handed to you, and then you're arriving at the truth through that process of questioning. Whereas our system is kind of took off from the Guru Shishya tradition, in which your virtue as a student lay in taking tradition or parampara as it is given to you and passing it on to the next generation in the exact same way. It wasn't seen as something that you could change. And fundamentally, this makes a big difference in the way that young people see tradition as an unchangeable thing. They see it as something that they have to uphold. And where basically, you see this happening in schools all the time. You learn by rote and you're not allowed to question what happens. And yeah, so we need to ask ourselves, though, is it just limited to school, or is it limited to our lives as well? Have we been so indoctrinated into the system that we're not asking questions in life, and that too we're risking living by rote? So initially I had this, I'm just going to share this small bias that I had at the beginning. I thought that people who believed in arranged marriages, we had this whole heated debate in class, and I thought that maybe people who believed in the system of arranged marriage were brainwashed by tradition. But when I spoke to them, they thought I was brainwashed by modernity. They thought that, they saw just as I saw tradition as an imposition, some of my friends saw modernity as, by which they meant Western values, as an imposition. And next slide, please. Yeah. So basically, which one is it? Is it tradition? Is it modernity? Is it neither? I realized that both me and my friends were wrong, because modernity too is kind of a tradition, and tradition itself is not a rule book. It's a dialogue, and it's a dialectical process. Just as tradition affects us, we also affect tradition and culture. We change it. Chetan Bhagat recently made this, he recently said that, all the young Indian wants today is a naukri and a chokri. A good job and a girlfriend, a comfortable life in the big city. Except, these are simple wants, except in our context, we know the reality, because not to sound too pessimistic, but it's the same things portrayed in Chetan Bhagat's books, and a lot of us can really relate to it, because people are being pushed into streams of study and professions that they don't want to have anything to do with. And we do cave in, we give up our own unique vision of the world and kind of settle in a sense. And we may argue that it's a personal choice, but why is it that our personal choices look suspiciously like something that, everybody else is choosing, or something that we're used to? We're not really doing anything path-breaking here. In fact, there's a kind of path dependence that's there in the young folks of today. Basically, we have this default option that we keep going for, and I think we have only our lack of courage to blame. But it doesn't have to be this way, because times have changed, and our generation, on so many levels, exists in a different frame altogether from the previous generation. And we have a lot of options, and the choice is ultimately ours, and it's going to affect us. So we have a pretty big decision to make here as to whether we are going to choose, go on the same path or try something different, whether we're going to be these commodities manufactured on an assembly line, with only our eccentricities to separate us, or if we're going to be products with our own USP. And the ideas that I'm saying right now are not new, but they're certainly recent. They've been around for maybe 10, 15 years, and they're only coming into their own now. It is our generation that is bringing about these changes. And okay, so recently things like the decriminalization of homosexuality or the anti-corruption movement that's happening in India, these are all products of our generation. So we're kind of waking up from this slumber and saying that we are questioning things. We're saying that why does it have to be this way? Why can't it be this different way? And the most important thing about this is that we're having a dialogue, and that's how change, progress happens. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? It's like in Alice in Wonderland when Alice asks the cat, which road do I take? And the cat says, well, where do you want to go? And Alice says, I don't know. And the cat says, well, it doesn't matter then. Any old road will get you there. So, yeah. Last slide, please. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Basically, I just want to point out that we think right now that history is created in the big things, in the big events. But I'd like to say that history is actually created in the small things that we do every day, the personal choices we make, to think or not to think, to hold our tongues or to speak up, to act or not to act. And all our actions have a ripple effect on those around us. And that's how, and every time we conform or we don't, regardless, every time we do what we want or we do what other people want us to do, we're shaping the world into our vision or someone else's vision. And yeah, the universe isn't made up of atoms. It's made up of stories. And these stories are shaped in college campuses and coffee houses around the country, not just in the boardrooms and the government buildings. And one of the hardest parts about growing up is realizing that, your parents, the previous generation whom you looked to for all the answers, in fact, don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers. So we have to kind of sit and figure it out. And how do we find the answers? It can be broken down into a two-step process. The first step is difficult. It's honest conversation. As Lester Bangs said in Almost Famous, the only currency in this bankrupt world is what you share with someone when you're both uncool. And even if this other uncool person is your parents, or if it's, someone else in society, we have to sit down, as a generation, Satyamev Jayate style, and have these discussions. And only when we put our own fragmented understandings of the world together, our kaleidoscopic paradigms, can we create a bigger picture and get a more holistic idea of what's going on and what the way forward is. The second step is my call for action for today. It can be summed up best in the words of Mahatma Gandhi when he said, be the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you.